In the heart of Africa, in a quiet village surrounded by hills that always seemed to whisper when the wind blew, there lived a woman named Adan, who carried with her a mystery darker than midnight itself, a secret that even the oldest trees in the forest seemed to lean closer to hear. Adan was not born ordinary, her birth came with omens. The night she entered the world, the sky bled red with a strange eclipse, the kind that made the old women of the village spit on the ground and murmur prayers, and the kind that made men clutch their charms and shut their doors against unseen spirits. Her mother, a frail woman with eyes like dying embers, died before the first rooster crowed, and her father vanished into the forest a year later, leaving the infant girl to be raised by her grandmother, Mama Oji, who was known in the village as a midwife and a keeper of secrets. Mama Oji often told stories by the fire, stories that the children loved and the adults feared, but when she spoke about the flower that bled without dying, her voice always dropped, her eyes darting around as if the shadows themselves were listening. That flower, the hibiscus, bright red and soft like velvet, was beautiful to the innocent eye, but in the tongue of the elders it was called Udara Obara, the blood flower, and they said it was a gift from the river goddess, given long ago to a desperate woman who wanted her enemies destroyed. The flower could feed, it could heal, but it could also curse, and those who misused it would find themselves bound to spirits they could never control. Adan grew up hearing these warnings, but where others trembled, she listened with fascination, storing every word like treasure in her heart. As she grew, her beauty became like the flower itself, red lips, eyes that shone too brightly, skin that glowed as though touched by fire. Men wanted her, women envied her, and whispers followed her like shadows, whispering that she was touched by spirits. She learned quickly that she was different. When other girls played, she wandered into the forest, plucking herbs, listening to the language of birds, and sitting by the river for hours as if waiting for something to rise from beneath the waves. The villagers began to fear her, and though they never accused her openly, doors would quietly close when she passed, and mothers would draw their children near. Yet, ironically, it was this same fear that gave her power, for fear makes people obey. It was Mama Oji who first taught her to brew Zobo, the sweet drink made from the hibiscus flower. Zobo was a common delight in the village, a drink of refreshment on hot afternoons, a companion at celebrations, and a comfort in times of sorrow. But Mama Oji, unlike the others, taught Adan to see beyond the taste and color. Every drink has a spirit, she whispered, crushing the hibiscus petals in her wrinkled hands, her voice heavy with warning. And this one has blood in it. Handle it with care, or it will handle you. But Adan, curious and bold, asked questions others dared not. Could the spirit be controlled? Could it be bent to her will? Mama Oji only frowned and tapped her granddaughter's head. Child, curiosity killed not only cats but people too. You are playing with rivers that drown, with fires that do not burn out. Adan pretended to obey, but in her heart the fire had already been lit. One evening, when the moon was thin like a silver blade, Adan went to the forest alone. She plucked hibiscus flowers with trembling fingers, each red petal glowing strangely in the moonlight, and as she carried them home, she thought she heard whispers riding the wind. She brewed the Zobo that night, but unlike her grandmother's careful rituals, she added a drop of her own blood into the pot, watching it swirl into the crimson liquid like smoke dissolving in air. She tasted it, and in that instant her body shivered as though something ancient had entered her. She dreamt that night of rivers running backward, of children crying in silence, and of herself standing taller than the trees, with shadows bowing before her. She woke with sweat clinging to her like a second skin, and though fear licked at her, excitement burned stronger. From that night, Adan's life began to change. The villagers noticed first that her drinks tasted richer, sweeter, more irresistible than anyone else's. People who drank from her calabash often came back thirsty for more, not knowing why. Her stall in the market began to thrive, and soon she became the most sought-after seller of Zobo, even as others who brewed it withered into obscurity. Yet along with her rise came whispers of strangeness. Those who drank her Zobo claimed they dreamt of rivers, of voices calling their names, of shadows that followed them even in daylight. Some said they woke with unexplained marks on their skin, as though invisible hands had touched them in the night. At first, these tales were brushed aside as foolish gossip, for who would suspect a sweet drink of carrying curses? But the old ones watched, and Mama Oji, before her death, warned her granddaughter with trembling hands, "You are feeding them more than Zobo, Adan. You are feeding them yourself, and one day they will not just drink from you, they will take you. But Adan's heart was no longer guided by warnings. Power is a sweet poison, and the more she saw her influence grow, the more she craved. She began to believe that she was chosen by the spirits themselves, that the blood flower had answered her hunger and made her something greater than human. And when her grandmother died and left her truly alone, the last restraint on her path was gone. It was then that she began to notice the children. Children, unlike adults, drank without suspicion, with open joy, and she loved the way their laughter echoed after sipping her Zobo. Yet she also noticed something darker. When they drank, their eyes sometimes flickered strangely, their games turned violent, and their dreams, when they spoke of them, were filled with rivers, shadows, and voices. Instead of fear, Adan felt fascination. Children were pure vessels, and the spirits seemed to cling to them more easily. She wondered what would happen if they drank more, drank often, drank until the spirits fully claimed them. And with that thought, a new chapter of her life, and of the village's horror, began. The day she decided to start selling her Zobo directly to the school, no one dared oppose her. After all, who would refuse sweet refreshment for their children? It seemed like generosity, it seemed like kindness. But beneath her gentle smile and soft words, something darker was brewing. And though the villagers did not yet know it, the curse of the blood flower had found its stage. The whispers in the hills grew louder, the wind carried omens through the trees, and in the stillness of night, even the river goddess stirred, knowing that a storm unlike any before was about to break upon the land. Adan's stall in the market grew busier with every passing day, but what she brewed at night in the silence of her hut was not known to all. She had stopped using the hibiscus flowers the way her grandmother had taught her. Now she mixed them with chants she remembered from dreams, whispers she heard in the wind, and secret offerings she left by the river. When others saw her plucking the bright red petals, they thought she was only preparing her famous Zobo, but in truth she was deepening a bond with something unseen, something that answered her whenever she spilled a drop of blood into the steaming pot. At first it was small. Her customers smiled more, their bodies grew light, their lips always thirsted for her drink. But slowly, stranger things began. The children who drank her Zobo would run and play as before, but sometimes they would stop suddenly, staring at shadows as if listening to voices no one else could hear. Some would laugh at nothing, others would draw strange shapes in the dirt, shapes the elders recognized but refused to speak of. And yet, because no child fell ill, no one thought to question her too deeply. It was just Adan, the beautiful Zobo woman, whose drinks tasted better than rain on a dry throat. But Adan herself noticed the deeper change. She could feel power swelling in her, as if each sip taken by others returned to her multiplied. When she walked through the village, heads bowed without knowing why. When she spoke, people listened, even when she said little of importance. The spirits had begun to gather around her, she knew, using her Zobo as their doorway. Sometimes at night she heard the voices of children calling her from the river, though no child stood there. Sometimes she dreamt of classrooms filled with shadows instead of pupils. She began to smile at the thought that the drink meant to refresh was slowly binding souls. Soon, Adan offered her Zobo to the school itself. At first, the teachers thought it kindness, a woman sharing her success with the young. The children lined up with excitement, their tongues stained red from the hibiscus, and their laughter filled the compound. But after a few weeks, strange stories began to spread. Children waking in the night screaming of rivers and women with red eyes, children sleepwalking into the forest, children refusing their mother's food but begging for Zobo. The elders gathered in whispers, yet no one dared confront Adan directly, for fear made their throats dry, and desire for her sweet drink made their courage weak. And Adan, sitting in her hut with jars of crimson liquid glowing like rubies in the dim light, smiled to herself, knowing the spirits were now fully awake, and that the school was only the beginning of her plan. At first the changes in the children were brushed aside as playful mischief, but soon the signs grew too heavy to ignore. The little ones who once laughed freely began to speak in tones too deep for their years, uttering words that chilled even their mothers. Some of them, while playing in the sand, drew symbols that matched carvings found only on ancient stones near the river shrine, symbols no child should know. Others woke screaming from nightmares of a woman with burning eyes who poured rivers into their mouths until they drowned. Teachers noticed that in class, pupils would stare at Adan's stall outside the school fence, their mouths watering, their focus lost until they tasted her drink again. It was as if the Zobo had become more than refreshment, it had become hunger, need, a tether that bound their young souls. Parents prayed harder, lighting candles and burning herbs, but the children grew restless, their sleepwalking worsened, and some even began speaking to shadows as if to unseen friends. The strangest part was that none of them fell sick in body. Instead, their strength grew, their eyes gleamed with a strange shine, and their laughter, when it came, sometimes carried an echo that was not entirely human. The elders murmured that the spirits of the river had found vessels, and though their lips trembled, none dared point a finger at Adan directly, for her beauty and the sweetness of her Zobo clouded reason. Adan herself watched with satisfaction, her heart swelling with power each time a child begged for more. She had discovered what her grandmother had always feared, the blood. Flower was not just for healing or cursing, it was a bridge between worlds, and children, pure and open, were the easiest doors to push wide. At night, she sat by her jars of crimson drink and whispered to the river goddess, asking for more, offering songs and drops of blood into the pot. And the river answered, not with words, but with dreams, visions of herself standing above the village while children with glowing eyes knelt before her. She began to dress more brightly, to walk with pride, to speak with the confidence of one who knew she was untouchable. But while her fame grew, so did the fear in the village, and the whispers sharpened into suspicion. Something unnatural was happening to the children, and though no one yet dared confront her, the curse was spreading like a shadow at sunset, swallowing innocence cup by cup. The village could no longer stay silent when the strangeness of the children began to disturb even the strongest of hearts. Mothers whispered of little ones who slipped out of their mats at night and were found standing by the riverbank at dawn, their eyes glazed, their feet muddy, their lips murmuring songs no one had taught them. Fathers spoke of sons who no longer obeyed, who stared at their parents with eyes too old, too knowing, and sometimes laughed when scolded as though listening to another voice. Fear gathered like a storm cloud, and at last the elders met beneath the great iroko tree, their faces lined with worry, their voices trembling. It is the drink, one finally said, though he lowered his eyes quickly, for to accuse Adan outright was dangerous. Another spoke of calling in someone stronger than them, someone who knew how to walk with spirits without losing herself. After much debate, they sent a message across villages to an old priestess named Nena, who was said to be guided by the ancestors and feared even by river spirits. When Nena arrived, wrapped in white cloth with cowries clinking at her ankles, silence fell upon the village. The children, usually restless, froze when she stepped into the schoolyard, their eyes fixed on her as though they recognized her from dreams. She walked among them, her staff tapping the earth, her nostrils flaring as if scenting the air. These children, she said slowly, are not entirely themselves anymore. Something has been poured into them beyond flour and water. The crowd shifted uneasily, glancing at Adan, who stood apart with her jars gleaming red under the sun. Nena did not name her directly, but her gaze lingered long on the younger woman, and in that silence, everyone felt the weight of the truth pressing down. That evening, Nena performed a test. She gave each child a bowl of plain water blessed with herbs and told them to drink. Some spat it out violently, gagging as though it burned them. Others wept, clawing at their throats, crying that it tasted bitter. But when Adan appeared with her Zobo, their cries turned to longing, their hands reaching, their voices begging. The villagers gasped, for no spell could be clearer than the craving they saw with their own eyes. Yet Adan only smiled faintly, her face calm, as though daring anyone to challenge her. It is only sweetness they crave, she said, her voice smooth as silk. Children love what is sweet. But Nena shook her head. No, child, what you brew carries the river's shadow. You have opened a door that should have remained closed. From that day, the investigation was no longer hidden. Parents began to watch Adan closely, elders kept their ears to the wind, and the priestess walked the village like a lioness among goats. Yet Adan, though surrounded by suspicion, did not tremble. Instead, her Zobo grew even more sought after, her stall more crowded, and the children's eyes burned brighter each time they drank. The village was caught between fear and desire, bound in silence, while the curse, like roots beneath the soil, spread deeper and deeper. It was on a night when the moon hid its face behind heavy clouds that the truth finally tore itself into the open. Nena, the priestess, had watched quietly for days, but she knew that watching alone would not break the hold of spirits. She needed proof so heavy that even the blind would see. She rose before dawn, when the village still slept, and followed the faint hum that drifted on the wind. An old song, deep and broken, the kind that belongs to neither human nor bird. The sound led her to Adan's hut, where a dim glow leaked through the cracks. Peering in, she saw the younger woman standing before her great clay pot, her hands raised, her lips chanting words that curled like smoke in the air. Around her, jars of Zobo shimmered unnaturally, their crimson glow pulsing as though alive. And then, with calm certainty, Adan pricked her finger and let blood drip into the bubbling drink. At once the liquid swirled, and for a heartbeat, faces appeared in the red surface, faces of children, their mouths open in silent cries. Nena's staff shook in her hand, for she had seen enough. The Zobo was no mere refreshment, it was a vessel binding young souls to a river of darkness. By sunrise, the priestess had gathered the elders, mothers, and fathers, leading them to Adan's hut. They burst in, and though Adan had already sealed her jars, the air was thick with the stench of iron and the faint echo of voices. "You feed them more than drink," Nena thundered. "You feed them to the spirits." The crowd gasped, some covering their mouths, others glaring with rage. Mothers cried out as they remembered their children's strange dreams, fathers clenched their fists, and the elders, pale with fear, finally found words to accuse. But Adan did not cower. She lifted her head, her eyes glowing like embers, and said in a voice that carried through the hut, "Yes, I feed them, and they feed me. Do you not see? The spirits have chosen me. The children are strong because of me. I am no witch to be feared. I am the bridge between worlds, and without me, this village is nothing." Her beauty seemed sharper in that moment, her voice sweeter, and for a second the crowd wavered, torn between horror and awe. But Nena struck her staff on the ground, the sound cracking like thunder. "No," she said, her voice like iron. "You are a slave to a curse, and you have dragged the innocent with you." At her words, the children outside wailed as one, their voices high and eerie, as though the spirits within them had been struck. The villagers trembled, for the proof was undeniable. Their sons and daughters were bound, their laughter stolen, their innocence entangled in Adan's hunger. Cries of "witch" filled the air, stones were lifted, curses spat, and for the first time, Adan's smile faltered. She realized that her secret, once her shield, had become her chain, and the village that once feared her now hungered for her downfall. The night of reckoning came swiftly, carried by the cries of children and the fury of parents who had been blind for too long. The elders decreed that Adan must face judgment beneath the iroko tree, where truth was always dragged into the light, and so she was bound and brought before the entire village, her jars of Zobo lined at her feet like blood-filled offerings. The children stood apart, their eyes glowing faintly, their lips trembling as though spirits whispered in their ears, and the sight alone was enough to make even the bravest men shudder. Nena stepped,